Welcome to today's webinar, Top Dog Tricks for Troubleshooting SCORM Content, which we do have a kind of a dog theme. My name is Joe Donnelly. I work in the customer support area of Rusty Software, and along with me, I have my colleague, George Vilches, Principal Software Engineer at Rusty Software. Sorry, George. Stomped all over you saying hello. And we'll be presenting today's webinar. While SCORM may be the old, George and I have a few tricks up our sleeves on how to identify the problems you might run into with your SCORM courses. Also, my handsome pug Drake, who is here. I can't believe he's here, honestly, y'all. And George's adorable corgi named Trixie. Oh, nice, nice. We'll hopefully bring you a little bit more, a little bit of entertainment to go along with the learning today as we go through the slides. So some of you may have been with Chris Tompkins and myself back in the fall when we did our SCORM 101. And in that talk, we mostly did best practices, but today we're gonna get a little bit more technical in this continuing journey through the SCORM series. While there will be some technical bits, there is probably going to be a little bit of overlap in what we talked about the last webinar, but that's because a lot of these best practices that we're going to talk about in troubleshooting bits we're going to talk about, well, they overlap, and it's worth talking about again. So as a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded and all of the slides will be shared in the next few days. All right, we'll get started. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about understanding and fixing common LMS launch failures. We're going to talk about some best practices for creating and publishing your e-learning. Options for testing and troubleshooting, always a good thing to talk about. And how to decipher course debug logs in SCORM Cloud. We're going to share that out live and kind of walk through some debugging. Now, another thing to note, we have an hour-ish. We probably won't use an hour. Unless George and I tend to noodle, which we both do noodle. Try not to tell too many stories, but a thing to note is that we are just really scratching the surface here. SCORM errors and bad behavior in e-learning courses can manifest in several ways. So we're going to talk through what we'll call the not so greatest hits. Just to start, the SCORM experience itself starts well before you even really launch the course in your LMS. SCORM itself has a packaging spec that has specific rules for how that zip file needs to be set up. Step 2 would be, after you've got your package, import it into your LMS. And only then will you get runtime data and then the reporting data that you expect. This all being said, all of the troubleshooting of all these 3 to 4 pieces are connected, as it's hard to know if you have a packaging issue before you actually import the course. If the course imports, you may still run into an issue with how it launches. And then once it launches, you might run into some runtime issues. So they're all kind of connected. And so what kind of errors are you going to run into? The good news is I have George with us here to talk us through some of the things you may encounter.
Thanks, Joe. There are so many things you may encounter. So let's hit it right off. This screen is my personal favorite, least favorite. A lot of you have probably seen this screen. This is that screen that Articulate 360 shows when you go to launch a course and then you encounter this certain class of problem. There's a lot of ways that this type of thing can happen. We'll hit a few as we go here. But it's no big deal to get to the screen. It says right there, if you press OK, you're going to get debug information. That'll help you figure it out. You're all instructional designers. This is no big deal. You build e-learning courses every day. It's cakewalk, right? Well, that debug panel is not as helpful as you might expect. There's a lot of great stuff in here, don't get me wrong. This tells us all about where did the course go looking for the things it needs to get started, what did it try to look for, such as, am I even a SCORM course, or an AICC course, or an XAPI course? Articulate and many content publishing tools can publish different standards and have tricks for trying to figure out which one you might be looking for. You can see in the screenshot, it's showing some AICC-based things, it's showing some SCORM-based things. There's 20 years of history here, and we've been building up techniques to kind of slipstream them around each other. But this debug log comes with 3 important challenges for any of you trying to use it. First is it's clearly written for a software developer. This was maybe an IT person. This is debugger level details on how the library operates. The second, this information comes way too late and is usually kind of far removed from the types of problems that actually cause the things that make this debug panel to come up. And then really the most important problem with this debug panel is that most courses don't have something as nice as this. And so you just get a blank screen with maybe your navigation buttons on it, and you got to try to figure out what it is that went wrong. You haven't even gotten to the point where you're looking or at what data might have been generated. This course never launched properly to begin with. This comes up so often that you have to start here to figure out why things didn't track before you can even really think about tracking. So we're going to talk about more accessible ways to dig into what it is that caused your course not to launch. So there's a myriad of reasons why your courses won't load. As we said, they can potentially happen long before the learner ever presses launch. You've got mismatch standards, a SCORM course that thinks it's one version, but it's being programmed as a different version. There's a lot of ways that can happen. You can have any manner of bad or broken JavaScript. Your course can be loaded on a server, stored in like an oil rig off the coast of Texas or somewhere, and you're trying to take it in Japan or London. Bad bandwidth, bad connections. Your course, we can't get into all of the possible ways your course is going to launch incorrectly in this conversation, and you wouldn't want to. We're going to hit a few that come up over and over again in our day-to-day support life and development life. Getting our wires crossed on SCORM 1.2 or 2004, pop-ups and framesets. I'm sure many of you have wrestled with what looks better there, and we'll talk about the whys and the hows of that. Cross-domain is a phrase that gets more popular every year, and the more popular it gets, the more problems that come along with it. And even some LMSs just don't do all the things right. We're not going to talk about any specific LMSs through this conversation. We're just going to talk about strategies to identify when your LMS might be misbehaving in a general sense. And there will only be a little bit of that. We're going to really focus on the course side of this for this conversation. So who is potentially at fault? I mean, you've already heard me say there's the course, there's the LMS. Sure, those are 2 players in it. But then there's the big in-between thing. And that's the part, excuse me, that's the part that is the actual you're interacting between these 2 systems. The browser, whether that's on a desktop or whether it's the mobile device in your hand. There's also the technical systems between those, firewalls and things that can potentially prevent content from being loaded. And then there's one other thing that sits between the LMS and the course and the browser and all the things that connect everybody together, and that's your learner. Your learners are going to do amazing things. They're all amazing people. We love your learners. We love our learners. And they come up with ways to use your systems that you could never possibly imagine. And as we go through here, we'll talk about a couple ways maybe that you can curate your ways that you present the information and present your materials to make it so that your learners are less likely to come up with amazing ways to solve problems that don't do well in a SCORM environment. Oops. So going right down the list, one of the most popular things that goes wrong when you're bringing a SCORM package to an arbitrary LMS is, did I get all of my standards lined up from one end to the other? SCORM, right off the bat, SCORM isn't one standard. It's 4 or 6, but we don't normally talk about the other 2. But from a runtime perspective, when these courses are initializing and we're collecting the learner data, we only care about one distinction across 2 of those versions in general, SCORM 1.2 and SCORM 2004. 2004 has multiple breakdowns, but they all have a very similar runtime. At runtime, there's a special key in JavaScript that the course is responsible for looking up. It's either called API in the SCORM 1.2 world, or it's called this API underscore 1484 underscore 11 in the SCORM 2004 world. Those numbers are really important and are completely meaningless except for making sure you get it right every single time. It's interesting that it's the course's job. It's the LMS's job to present these things, and then it's the course's job to know which one to go look and find. This is challenging because the course, the way that you specify that value to be run from the course runtime side, and the way that you specify that how that value should be picked on the LMS is done at the packaging side, and never the twain shall meet. They're fully independent processes. And so since they're not connected, it's really easy to make a bunch of mistakes that could cause them to be misaligned. If you repackage your course with one of the several different packaging tools that are out there, you could end up packaging in a 1.2 version for a 2004 runtime. The authoring tool could give you the wrong wrapper or the wrong API adapter. It's a little less common because they're supposed to be tuned not to have that happen, but there's lots of ways to cross wires when you're doing your various publishing attempts. There's even places where the LMS only speaks one of the SCORM versions and not the other. Because of the way packaging works and because of the way the runtime works, you may not know that at launch time. And so it'll look like the course uploaded fine. It'll say that the course is a SCORM course. Sure, it's a SCORM course. There's some distinctions that matter there. So then when you go to launch, the course is going to break because the right API adapter doesn't even exist on that LMS whatsoever. So the moral of that story is you have to actually talk to your LMS vendor, make sure they support the version of SCORM that you're expecting to launch. So we're going to do a bit of an interactive moment here. We're going to look at a SCORM manifest, and we've got some very simple breakdowns that'll tell you the easiest way to look at your manifest and determine is it SCORM 1.2 or SCORM 2004. There's an obvious way and there's a non-obvious way that they're actually both shockingly important to know both techniques. So right here, Joe has given us a standard SCORM 2004 manifest. Now, the easiest way, if you see where his mouse pointer is and what he's about to highlight, is that we've marked it as a 2004 manifest by calling it the 2004 third edition manifest. That's one of the SCORM 2004 substandards. There's other things in here that would give me a clue in that manifest tag and such that it might be SCORM 2004 third edition, but that schema version is, we'll say, the most common and most reliable way that it should be able to tell you. But shockingly, there's all sorts of ways that tag can be in there that is not helpful if it's not inside the metadata block, or, and one that comes up way more than it ever deserves to, if the metadata block is somewhere else in the document. It gets nested in all sorts of random places. No idea what tools produced it like that or why, but it happens all the time. And so the LMS at that point can't find that schema version tag that tells you, is it 1.2? Is it 2004 fourth edition? So we have one other trick up our sleeve that is 100% reliable as the LMS will always be able to tell you whether it's 1.2 or 2004 in general. And on the resource tag, now in a SCORM manifest, the resource tag is the one that tells you what is the HTML file I'm going to launch? Because in the end, a SCORM package is just a web application. It's a client-side only web application, but there's still a set of web pages that are playable. And both 1.2 and 2004 have these resource tags. And they have a thing that tells you what type of SCORM package or what type of resource it is, called the SCORM type. And it turns out, and you can see where Joe's about to highlight it there, in both 1.2 and 2004, there's a SCORM type tag, and there's exactly one difference between them. That capital T in SCORM 1.2, that's going to be a lowercase t. In SCORM 2004, it has to be a capital T. I know that seems like an incredibly fiddly detail, and why would that ever matter? XML is a very special world, and things like case sensitivity sometimes come into play, and in the standard specifically, they change the case of that one letter on this required tag. So every SCORM manifest is going to have it one way or the other. And the good news for you is that means unless somebody made an incredibly big mistake along the way, you'll probably be able to tell whether it's SCORM 1.2 or 2004 just from knowing that, just from looking at that one piece alone, and it's always reliable. There's lots of other tricks to fall back from here, but generally speaking, with those two, you'll hit 99% of the things that you need to cover you for figuring out what standard the course is. So that, excuse me. So now that you know what version it is, we've got to make sure the manifest is in the right place in the package so that that package can be loaded into the LMS correctly. This is another one of those moments. It happens all the time. And you know what? Instructional designers and folks who build and package courses, This mistake is okay to make, not because it works, but because it's so easy to make this mistake. We've all done it a bunch of times. In your operating system, whenever you go and you want to compress a folder of files, you probably just click on the folder and you right click, you choose compress or archive, whatever it may be appropriate for your OS. And that would be normal anywhere else, but it usually packs those files in a folder inside the zip file. The manifest, the IMS manifest.xml, for a SCORM package to be valid, has to live at the root. If it doesn't live at the root, usually an LMS may not even be able to find it. But if your LMS is particularly clever and can go looking through the folders and try to find it, you may still end up in a situation where the content, it's confused about where the content is loaded and launching. So it could find the manifest, it can get it all set up, and then it goes to launch it, and well, it got the wrong path because the extra directories threw everything off. So go into the folder, highlight all the files, Control A, Command A, whatever platform you're on, and choose compress. That will put it so that the manifest is at the root, all the files that are expected to be at the root are at the root. So open these packages, go in there, zip them to your heart's content. Make sure, when I say zip, I mean a very specific thing. I do not mean a WinRAR or a 7-zip file. SCORM requires it has to be exactly and only a zip file, a traditional PK zip. That's incredibly precise and incredibly important to the standard. So we've talked a lot about, SCORM has been around for a while. It's a relatively old standard. It's over 20 years old at this point. I think SCORM can drink at this point if we were to take it to a bar. E-learning has changed a little bit in the last 20 years. The web has changed a little bit. We have modernized browsers and things. We have at least 2 new major standards of the world, XAPI and CMI5, and that doesn't even include all of the additional, excuse me, the additional standards have grown up in e-learning outside of the space of the ADL. And well, we're forward-looking people. We love adopting new standards and all these bigger and better ways to capture data and do learning things. But as much as we love moving the world forward, if you're going to stay in the SCORM world, you need to stay in the SCORM world. Don't try to get clever and package an XAPI with a SCORM and into one ball, or try to get a CMI5 package and a SCORM package into one ball. It kind of looks like they can go together because nothing in the packages collide with each other. The problem is there's no rules as to which one gets priority. So if you have an LMS that supports one or more of these standards, you're not going to know which one it's going to upload and get. And it could change each time you upload it. So if you're trying to do replace version, you may have started with the SCORM package, but then it might think you're moving on to an XAPI package. Please no. Trust Trixie on this one. I'm going to take a quick moment here for a small plug. CMI5 is a fantastic forward-moving standard for people who are currently doing SCORM. It deals with the LMS problem. It does what SCORM can do with a much wider breadth because you can track all sorts of new things like VR, and it has much deeper learner record capture because you've got it, CMI5 is based on XAPI. This isn't an XAPI, it's not a CMI5 talk, but you folks who are doing SCORM today, I'd love to see all of you who are doing SCORM start getting active in CMI5. There's a project coming out towards the end of the year that's going to bring a test suite both for CMI5 content and for CMI5 LMSs. And if you could be out there telling people, telling the LMS vendors that you're wanting to use CMI5 because you're going to be able to get all this new rich data in your courses, and you're talking to the authoring tools you're working with, make sure you can publish a CMI5 so you can get that sort of output and work with all of those other environments, capturing data from VR, from AR, from mobile apps. Well, I'd be really excited about that, but I think it's going to be great for the overall ecosystem of learning. But there's some practical reasons why, and one of them's on the very next slide. The pop-up frameset world. This is where so many of our problems come from. Mismatched standards, they create all sorts of havoc, sure, but they're not the issue that most people think of when you're thinking about SCORM problems. Usually you think of at least one learner encounter where the course tried to load in a frameset, it tried to load in a pop-up, but it didn't launch, or they couldn't see the thing. Probably both for many of you. SCORM makes a fair number of choices that encourage pop-up usage, but the last 15, 20 years on the internet showed us that if we allow pop-ups to run rampant, everybody's going to use them for super bad things. So even though SCORM and e-learning may have good good intentions. The rest of the world got really crabby about pop-ups. So we can't just blindly rely on pop-ups working anymore. Ad blockers do all sorts of things that prevent pop-ups from loading. Browsers block pop-ups in aggressive ways and even block the JavaScript that might launch the pop-up without you doing a very special dance to get everything to launch correctly, both on your LMS's side and on your courseware's side. Your publishing tools try to help you out on this, but most of you know your publishing tools can't solve all the ways that pop-ups can be prevented. So, excuse me. When we talk about the things that stop the course from even getting to initialize, the pop-up not loading is one of the biggest ones. And for that reason, we sometimes like framesets. Unfortunately, framesets, when I say frameset, I mean a thing that's nested in the same window. Usually the LMS has its trimmings around the outside with whatever its logos are and such, and then your course shows in the same window. There's also a fair number of problems with framesets. As the world has gone mobile, and we're doing a lot more with display in a mobile environment, a lot of content was not built to live inside a frameset. It expected to have access to the whole window. And while there's a number of technical reasons as to why they would try to base their belief that they would have access to the whole window, by basing their belief on that, there's lots of problems with content, with scaling, with scrolling, and with just general overall device width management for how your content displays. So sometimes you're going to have a piece of content that you've published that you can't display in a frameset, so you're going to be forced to launch it in a pop-up. But on pop-ups in mobile, you have a different set of problems. Mobile devices have been done amazing strategies to try to preserve battery. I know some people are watching this right now on their 10% battery left on their phone, and they don't think that mobile devices are doing a lot to preserve battery. But there's a tremendous number of tricks that are put in play to make things run with less overall cycles. Unfortunately, when you load a SCORM course in a pop-up, you need cycles on both that course as well as all of these background windows that have popped up that run the LMS. And your phone browser is going to try its best to give those as few JavaScript cycles as possible. So you go through, you do your course, you close out, and if that LMS window, when it first gets access to this again, doesn't have time to get all those cycles back and process through everything, it's entirely possible that learner data can be lost. So once learner data is lost, angry learners, it's all downhill from there. So you want to run stuff in mobile on framesets if your authoring tools won't otherwise get in the way, or you have a special environment set up. Mobile apps can do a little bit more to soften the blow on this. That'll help collect the data and preserve it so that it can behave. But whatever the case, you've got big challenges making SCORM friendly and mobile, and you have a real tight balancing act on a per LMS basis as to which one's going to behave better for preserving data. So, excuse me. I want you to take note here of Trixie on this side for a moment, my lovely corgi. CMI5 is actually a really big help in this environment in a way, because SCORM requiring this frameset or requiring this pop-up thing, CMI5 we've modernized. We don't need these extra pop-ups to make things work theoretically. So you don't need the wrapping window. All the JavaScript that transmits the learner data and does the course experience lives in that main window, which means that the course is completely responsible for it, sure. But it also means that the mobile device and the thing running it gets all the cycles available. And there's no weird potential handshakes that you have to worry about is the data going to get where it's going to go. If everything is behaving, then the data will for sure get stored and saved the way it should. This is another reason why we're a big fan of saying start pushing CMI5 adoption. It's going to make your life on mobile devices better. Whether the user closes the wrong pop-up, whether this course goes crazy trying to size inside a frameset, CMI5 is a partial solution to making your life much better in that situation. Please check it out. The last major change, or the last major thing we're going to talk about diagnosing that comes up more and more every year with SCORM courseware is the problems around cross-domain. I'm not going to get highly technical on the problems of cross-domain, except for when we show you how to identify when you have a cross-domain problem. The short version is your LMS at lmsdomain.com likely isn't doing everything it does at lmsdomain.com. Whether it's having the content loaded from centralized services like CDNs that may be on a separate domain, whether it's embedding plugins for identifying users or embedding plugins for shopping experiences and such. Those, excuse me, all of those things, they're great. It's awesome that the internet is so much more interconnected than it's ever been. But that also has led a lot of bad actors to once again do a lot of bad things. Are you starting to see a trend? Every time we give people a little bit of power, they abuse it. Then the browsers try to take some of that power away from us, and SCORM is in the crosshairs, getting a bunch of flack for how it suddenly stopped working. Well, it's because the browsers do need to protect themselves in these ways. Unfortunately, there's a lot of things that can go wrong if once you layer these things in because of all these extra browser protections, and SCORM hasn't changed in any meaningful way in 20 years, and so we have to try to accommodate those issues. So since SCORM is really good at triggering those risks, let's dig a bit into what cause and effects there might be from cross-domain problems. So while I'm going to bounce back and forth a bit between causes and effects here, when you have a cross-domain problem, what I'm really saying is you have a JavaScript error when you try to launch your course. All of the cross-domain related behaviors that occur, they're either going to be extremely loud JavaScript errors, or they're going to be quiet but still usually visible JavaScript errors. Your course might not launch, your course might frame in, but it won't actually show the content. You'll definitely won't get any initialization or tracking if it's a cross-domain error that happens early on. And the thing is that there's a lot of different things about what a course could be doing that could trip a cross-domain error. Window.hop is the one we're going to demo. So I'm going to talk a bit about that in the next slide. If the LMS content lives on a different domain, or the SCORM adapter, most SCORM courses look for the SCORM adapter by checking for every parent frame and for every pop-up window. But the algorithm that is recommended for how to do that isn't exactly as straightforward as what I just described. And sometimes things can go off to the side, and where API adapters can be put can be off to the side a little bit. And so if the algorithm starts looking around a little ways to try to find it, it might trip over a frame on a different domain or a pop-up on a different domain before it gets to the one that holds the SCORM adapter. And if it does that, well, that's a cross-domain error because JavaScript can't run on one domain. JavaScript started from one domain, can't run another domain. So all of these things will cause it to where you get those effects that you see in that right-hand column. So let me take you through one particular example of using your browser tools to get a sense of what you're looking for when you're trying to figure out if it's a cross-domain issue. So here we are in one great LMS in the world called SCORM Cloud. What we're going to do is I've slightly modified one of the golf examples to trip a certain type of cross-domain error. So as the content launches, you'll notice that the content itself displays, oh, no, it didn't display, but the navigation's there. All right, well, what happened to our content? We're supposed to have this nice golf course in here. Let's go to our browser's developer tools. In Chrome, that's under More Tools, Developer Tools. Every browser has a similar place. And let's look at our console. Well, we've got something in bright red. Bright red is always a great place to start. It's not 100% reliable, but do you see how it says from accessing a cross-origin frame, blocked a frame from accessing? That right there tells you you've got a cross-domain problem. So now you could stop there and just say, all right, well, we've got a cross-domain problem. But let's see if we can get a little bit more information about what that type of cross-domain problem is. We went looking to see if we could click on the error and see what was in there. But because we opened the developer tools after we already got started, we can't. So instead, we're going to leave the developer tools open. We're going to launch the course again. And that will let us see everything about the experience from the launch period till when it breaks. That's a very common strategy. Leave your dev tools open. So now this tells us what page to go look up. And so we can go look for the page in the list of things that were fetched. And it also tells us what line number to go look at right there, 119 at the end. So we scroll down to line 119. When we get there, there'll maybe be an obvious problem. And here we go. There's that window.top that I made reference to on the last slide. Window.top is the scourge of the e-learning business. It is my single least favorite line to see in JavaScript. It means that any structural thing that's been set up that window.top says, from the current place I am, look up all the frames till I get to the outermost window, the one that has your browser location bar and what you're on. It turns out that in a lot of experiences, whether you're dispatching content from another domain or you're using a CDN to deliver your content, you don't share the same domain with the CDN. In all of those cases, the domain the content's on, domain the LMS on, not the same. Window.top will cause that cross-domain exception and it shuts everything down from loading correctly. This breaks so many courses, especially courses that were made a few years back where people were a little less sensitive to this problem, which there's still millions and millions of those courses out there. So while this obviously isn't a strategy you can use to solve every single thing, what we just did there at least lets you know if there's a cross-origin problem, you can take this to your developers or to your content authoring tools and show them, look, we're getting a cross-domain problem, and get your LMS team involved at the same time, because those two groups will need to work together to address a solution most likely. Excuse me. So as you can see, we've got a lot of ways launching can fail. This whole beginning part was just getting the course to load. That's an awful lot, isn't it? So next, Joe's going to take us through the issues that might come up when you actually get to getting your course to load and trying to get all that data to save in the LMS and know where it is and if it's the right data. So Joe, take it away.
Thank you, George. Sorry, y'all. There we are. Okay, so as you probably noticed going through George's talk, there's a lot going on at Runtime, from the launch to showing the content, that sort of thing. And I thought it was best to maybe take a step back to talk through what is actually happening, especially right at the beginning. At bare mins, when you launch a SCORM course, what George was talking about, that weird handshake. Well, here's your weird handshake. The course is going to be required to initialize communication and terminate communication with the LMS. So basically, ask the LMS for the API, hopefully get it, then make some get and set values. So you could set things like status and score and time. It can grab data from the LMS. It can set interactions, which is what SCORM will call question and answer text. And then the big thing is terminating. So ending communication, saying it's done, putting all of its books back on the shelf, and then closing the window. But really, once again, at bare minimum, initialization, termination, the beginning and ending of the conversation are super important. Along with, I love that picture, along with the getting and setting of all that information, a thing that has come up from time to time, really from a long time ago and still comes up to this day, is bookmarking. Bookmarking is an important thing to do. This is more of a best practice, like the slide says. You should just do it. You should make sure this happens as often as you can possibly muster, mainly because we're going to talk about some tracking issues here in a minute. And if for some reason something happens and the learner's machine crashes, internet connection stops, which it's raining here, I'm basically waiting for George to have to take over. But anything could happen. And if you've got a good bookmark, then when that learner comes back in, hopefully they'll start where they left off. And if they're in the middle of an OSHA 30-hour training and they're 29 hours in and they miss a bookmark, then I don't want to be on that call with the learner. Really the big issue, I would say, is tracking issues. Why didn't my course complete? Why does my LMS not show a complete? I would classify this as the SCORM problem, because we talk about it quite a bit. Now, George talked about it a little bit earlier. I'm sure a lot of you have talked to me before in the past where I've talked about all of the things that could go wrong. You have 2 to 3 different applications sometimes talking to each other. You've got LMSs, content. You've got content delivery systems. Like George said, the learner is mixed up in there, their connection, all the stuff. And so there's this kind of a beautiful mixture of everything happening at once. And unfortunately, sometimes things can go sideways. What are those things? We're going to talk about exiting here on the next slide, so I'm not really going to dig too much into that. But the exit is a big piece. you'll want to make sure your course does what you expect it to do. Does the course set a past success status or past lesson status? And the LMS might want to complete it. Pop-ups and extensions, like George said, those things get in the way. You could have something in your browser that is just not allowing that communication to happen. And then, not to continue the theme of what George said, but the cross-domain issue. The cross-domain issue is something that happens. So, we were talking about tracking issues, and I mentioned exit on that last slide, and it really is for me. In a lot of the talks that I have and support tickets we do, exiting and basically trying to navigate around a bad exit is the thing we talk about the most. And so one of the things to consider is what happens at exit. Lots of things. So your course is already initialized and setting a bunch of data. It is hopefully going to terminate and then concede control. So the things that you want to make sure happen are when your course sets that data, when it sets score and sets status and all those things, we want that to happen really at runtime and not on the way out. So if you have a course that is setting all of that information while it's exiting, you're asking it to do a whole bunch of stuff while it's trying to exit, go through its exit routine. You're expecting the LMS to, accept all the books when they're getting thrown at it, and it really has a potential to go sideways in several ways. So if you allow yourself to have a moment for the course to set the information, to then maybe even throw a result slide in there, and I'm kind of skipping around a little bit, but throw a result slide in there before it exits. It gives everybody time to do all the things that it needs to do. After it does exit, or well, during the exit, you're going to want to make sure it calls LMS finish and terminate, closing that communication with the LMS. For a lot of the earlier standards, even though it is required in the spec, a lot of LMSs will handle the lack of an LMS finish. But really, when you're dealing with SCORM 2004, you got to have an exit. So make sure that terminates being called. And then lastly, the conceding control back to the LMS is a thing, because we've noticed some authoring tools will allow the learner to exit, and this happens a lot on a frameset launch, and then just kind of pops you into a goodbye page. And what that goodbye page is a page within the course. So technically, you're still in the course. So if a learner were to take a course, run through it, hit exit, think that they're doing all of the things that they should be doing, and then they say, good job, goodbye, you can now leave, and then they leave, they're still in session, technically. So you'll want to make sure that it concedes control back to the LMS. Now, what does a bad exit look like? Really quickly, a big one is the frameset launch. So when you're launching a course in the frameset of the player and the learner doesn't know how to leave. So maybe you don't have an exit button in there, or they just hard close the browser. So closing both the player and the course at the same time. If you're on your mobile device, which I had my mobile device right here so I could pick it up, but I'm not going to do that because it's over there now. But if you're on a mobile device, maybe just letting your mobile device go to sleep. Technically, once again, you're not really closing anything. And as George said, closing browsers in a mobile device, it's kind of wonky anyway. Setting the data on exit and the exit not really completing all the way, that is a real issue. So what can you do to get around this? Like we said, set the runtime data early, give yourself some time to do it. And just the big one is use an exit button. Do your best to light a path for your learner out of the course that maybe isn't like bright and shining lights, which is what I usually say. You should have blinking lights all around it. Click here, but give them a path to get out so that the course can do the thing that it needs to do, and then the learner can feel good about the fact that he or she has their completion, and they can go back to their job, because that's really the thing we want them to do. So a question that we do often get asked is, well, does my browser support SCORM? And really the quick and dirty answer here is SCORM really doesn't care too much about your browser for the most part. When I think of modern browsers, I can think of a few things that at least that I usually comment on. Chrome, Edge, and Safari. Well, these days they're kind of finicky about cookies. So if your content uses cookies in any manner, or your LMS for that matter, you should be aware. Make sure you're setting same site to none and all that. If you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to us. We've dealt with that some. IE is still a thing. IE is still out there, especially if you deal with banks, hospitals, government agencies. You may still run into Internet Explorer, and because of that, you should just be ready for it. And you know, I haven't seen a lot of courses that only like specific browsers, but I have in the past. And I feel like I had to mention Firefox because I mentioned everybody else, but I don't really have anything bad to say about Firefox. Most of the time, it just works for me. So it's usually a good browser to test on. SCORM does use JavaScript to communicate with the LMS. So like George said, you'll want to make sure that actually is happening and it isn't getting blocked. There's a number of content vendors, delivery providers out there. Shout out to SCORM Cloud Dispatch and Content Controller that use functionality to deliver content cross-domain. So you're going to want to make sure your browser allows this. Safari has some settings that can kind of get in the way there. And then lastly, Flash is gone. We talked about this in the fall, but we're still talking about it because there's still content out there that's trying to run with Flash in it. So lastly, your content may care about this, but really in the grand scheme of things, SCORM doesn't really care what browser you use, but you know, just be aware of those things that we've talked about. Now, lastly, or almost lastly, we've talked through a lot of things, a lot of the SCORM calls. We've talked through some of the hurdles that you might encounter, and really, the next question is, well, this is all well and good, but how do we test our content? How do we troubleshoot these things ahead of time so we can make sure the course is doing the things we want it to do? And you've got several options out there. A couple of them are kind of theoretical in that, you know, you can load your package onto your LMS ahead of time and test there. Most LMSs are going to have some way to do this via a preview, or hopefully have some sort of a logging and logging tool to help you get through that. You should always test in multiple browsers because of all the things we talked about on the last one, because Chrome might not behave the same way as Firefox does. As you know, same thing with IE. Your authoring tool. A lot of the authoring tools out there have preview mechanisms. I know that there's a couple of them that do, you know, actually reach out to SCORM Cloud to do those things. So you can actually test in the context of a training delivery system. Or, of course, you can use SCORM Cloud. It has a great debugging section, and I'm going to show that to you right now. And George, is that updated for you?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, I was not seeing that updated on my page. But so this is the SCORM Cloud, and I have picked up another golf course that I have conveniently already passed, so you don't have to see me click through this golf course, which I did in 28 seconds, which is pretty good, but I'd probably get razzed in the office because it's a little slow. But the section that you really want to look at is the debug logs here. And so if I click on my debug log here, I get this beautiful piece of information here. We've got our red sequencing that we're not going to worry about, and then the look ahead sequencer, we're not going to worry about that either. But all of this blue text here, this is all the runtime that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. Here's my content calling initialize and starting that handshake. There is my course grabbing the completion status from the LMS, seeing that it hasn't been launched before because it says unknown. Another great best practice is having your content set a completion status, even though it's not completed yet. It should set incomplete. You could end up in a situation where if for some reason your content doesn't set a status and it closes, there is some gray areas of the spec that will actually tell the LMS, hey, it didn't set a status at all. So I don't think it's communicative at all. You should just mark it completed, and you get kind of a false completion. But you've got some other stuff in here. We talked about bookmarking, CMI.location. That's SCORM 2004's bookmarking element. If I scroll a little bit further down, let's see here, we got a lot of objectives in there. Progress measure. I highlighted the one above it too, but progress measure is the one we talk about quite a bit lately. It is basically the percentage towards completion of a SCO. And there's really only two standards that do this well: SCORM 2004 4th edition and CMI5. So yet another arrow in CMI5's quiver, because that's something people like to report on. Going down a little bit further, I'm going to see my completion gets set, and this is kind of an odd sample in that the completion gets set right before the interactions, so it kind of dumps everything at once right before you exit. But in this case, I did get it completed. I know I'm completed because it says I'm 100% through with my progress measure here. And then I get all these wonderful interactions. So I'm going to get because this is SCORM 2004, I'll get my full question text, my full answer text, all that stuff. And then if I scroll further down to the bottom, just to kind of get back to my exit area, here's my score. So I know I've got my score. And then lastly, the last couple I'll check out is the exit type. We talk about this quite a bit when we talk about bookmarking issues, and then also what happens on relaunch. So CMI.exit in this particular instance, you can set it to nothing like we did. You can set it to suspend, which indicates to the LMS that the learner intends to come back and basically start where they left off. Or they can have a normal exit, and then the empty string here, both indicate that the attempt is over. And so on relaunch, they'll get a fresh set of runtime data and basically start from the beginning. And then once again, the big one, terminate. We're all done here. That means we're done. That means the course is ready to be closed, and we're all good. And also we're ready to be done. So that's really all we have for you today. We really appreciate y'all hanging out with us. We know your time is valuable, and hopefully you learned some things, and you can take some of that back and apply to your courses and any of the troubleshooting you have going on. As always, we're happy to help you troubleshoot things. So if you need help with something or really just want to chat, feel free to reach out to us at support@rusticysoftware.com, which creates a support ticket. Or if you wanted to learn more about any of our solutions or truly ask us anything, you can find us at our contact us button on our websites. And I think this is stage direction, open to Q&As. Should I say that? I shouldn't have said that out loud, should I, George?
You know what? I'm switching to my Q&A Trixie. She's had to listen to 50 minutes of us prattle on about SCORM. But I have seen some good questions come in, and you know what? I'm gonna rattle off one or two in your direction, Joe, and let's see where you can take this. So one that I thought was a great starter. You've been talking a fair amount about exit behaviors. One question or suggestion is for ensuring a smooth exit. Would an example of this be like in Captivate? So instead of you have a 10-slide presentation, don't complete on slide 10. Have your statuses and your score set on slide 9 for the module to be recognized as completed.
Yeah, 100%. Just a slide early. You don't even have to go crazy and give yourself 4 slides of results and whatnot. But yeah, I feel like that is a great idea. Yeah, the 10th slide being thanks for being here. I'm a big fan of hospitality, and I think that's a great idea. Yeah, but yeah, doing that exit a little, or setting that completion a little bit earlier is great.
And I've got one here that's a little more situational about how we get everybody to work together. So we've got your LMS vendors, we've got our content authoring people. When a problem comes up like this, we've got something doesn't launch or there's not tracking. How do we get them to work together better? What are the tricks we can get them to work together better instead of just finger pointing at each other?
That's one of the hardest things. And we get on the phone with a lot of people, and we find ourselves in the middle of that. And like I said, one of the hardest things is being in the middle of the finger pointing. And I've been on both ends of that, and I feel guilty when I'm when the thumb's pointing at me, if you will. And the best thing, I mean, honestly, it's just a communication thing. It's a, hey, y'all, we're all here to solve a similar problem. And, you know, the problem might not be on the LMS. It might not be on the course like George was talking about earlier. It's kind of hard to kind of sift through everything to figure out what it is. But it's, this is not really the SCORMy answer, but the answer I usually give is it just takes getting the right people on a call to understand that, you know, SCORM is never personal. I don't think so. But so just getting the right people on there to just to have the conversation.
Well, yeah, there are a lot of right people to get on both sides of the fence. There's so many content authoring tools out there now, and I don't recall, the last LMS count I saw was over 700 at this point. There's a lot of groups to pair together. We had another question come in very specific to bookmarking, whether in SCORM 1.2 or SCORM 2004, each with its appropriate bookmark flag CMI.location, CMI core lesson location. That's a technique that one of the question askers here says has been a good way for them to identify is any data being captured. But what they're asking is, should that variable always have a value? Should there always be a bookmark value for somebody who started a course? And this is, they say they work in articulate rise or storyline, but in a more general sense, do courses always set a bookmark value?
No, they don't. And technically, while location and cmi.core.lesson_location is the designated space for bookmarking, it may not. And I know that there are versions of authoring tools. I know some earlier versions of Articulate chose to use the suspend data bucket to put things, and they'll end up putting basically a large value that is something that the course understands to plop the bookmark in there. And it's totally valid to do. I mean, the suspend data bucket is a place for a course to put its stuff. And if it wants to put bookmark in there, if it wants to put interaction data in there, it can. So while there might be other ways to do bookmarking, I mean, obviously I would always want folks to do something with their bookmarking. And for me, it's easier to find a bookmark when it's in location because it is what it is. Going another route like suspend data is valid.
Great. All right. Here's one that I hear all the time. Do we have best practices for the completion status you set through your authoring tool? Do you prefer pass fail or pass incomplete or some other combination?
So I'm a big fan of out the gate sticking with the default, and I think a lot of the authoring tools, the default is passed incomplete because you're kind of hitting both sides of things, and chances are if it sets passed, then it's going to set completed. Or, and I don't like doing the assumption thing. Most places will say, oh, you're passed, well then you're probably completed. So if the LMS doesn't if the LMS is waiting on the completed, chances are they'll see the passed and say, ah, cool, you're completed too. But I like default just to start.
The authoring tools probably know at least some of what they're doing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And kind of on that note, for the folks who have been asking questions about a specific LMS that isn't SCORM Cloud, we are happy to answer any and all questions about that. Please reach out to us directly, and we'll dig into that. I won't be bringing those questions up during this conversation because if we start talking about one LMS, well, we've got to talk about them all, and they're all equally our babies, and we love them all equally. So, but I do see here that at least a couple of the people who have spoken up have said that they love using SCORM Cloud's performance to make other LMS vendors aware that they may not be playing up to snuff in some ways. So is there any specific strategies when someone comes to you and says, I've got this and it works in SCORM Cloud and it doesn't work on this other LMS, that you can give them to help them take the next steps?
Sure, and that is when we would ask for, when I showed the debug logs, I probably should have shown this, but if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's a want to share your debug log with us. And what it will do is, well, give me a link so that I can look at the debug log, scroll through just to see if there's anything out of the ordinary. Things like, oh, well, I noticed that this course just sets passed. maybe your LMS needs to set completed. Why don't you ask them that question, that sort of thing. Just kind of go through to see if anything jumps out at me. And then you can share that in like a positive manner with your LMS vendor, so that they don't feel like they're getting the finger pointed at them. They're just like, hey, I just saw this in this debug log. I don't know, Anyway.
Actually, there was another question also asking about that link. Do you think you could show that link really quick so that people know where to find it?
There we go. It's actually this guy right here. And it looks like the one to share this log with somebody else probably could deal with a space in between it. But this guy right here. So if you share this with anybody, they'll be able to get right to the debug log, including your LMS vendor. So they won't need a login, or even though there is a free trial. I probably should have mentioned that on the last page. If you are interested in trying SCORM Cloud, it is free to use. The only thing we're going to limit you on is the amount of space you use. So if you have like a giant 2 gig course, then chances are we're not going to let you import that. But if it's less than 100 meg and it uses just 100 meg of expanded space, then feel free.
All right. We have a couple minutes left, and there's been a few different questions now that have taken the bait on our CMI5 portions of this talk. And while this is a SCORM debugging talk, I'm going to take just a moment to address the highlights on these CMI5 questions. Why is it that it has fixed or improved on certain things in SCORM? Why is it, for instance, that CMI5 lets us avoid opening content in new window? That's because SCORM is a JavaScript specific standard. And that means there's a thing that the LMS provides that is in JavaScript, and there's a thing the course provides in JavaScript that have to talk to each other. And so both these things have to exist all the time. CMI5 has this really cool strategy where the course itself can be loaded as long as it's launched with a specific URL construction. It automatically has built into the course the technique to go ask the LMS for authorization credentials, not authentication, very different, authorization credentials, and to play in the context of that same window. So the LMS can actually redirect into the CMI5 course. And when the CMI5 course is done, there's rules to redirect back into the LMS. So you get rid of all of the extra framesets, all of the extra windows. CMI5 was specifically designed for a more modern internet and a more modern way of communicating. And because CMI5 is built on top of XAPI, which is a data collection standard we have been pitching for years, it's super exciting because it gives you this way to collect. SCORM collects, a very specific set of buckets of things. XAPI collects this huge list of things. Anything you can craft, and if we didn't think of a place to put it in the beginning, you can just put it in the extensions, and there's an infinite number of spots for extension data, so to speak. So CMI5 allows you to have the traditional LMS launch style experience, but collect data from anything in the world that you can get launched, and do it in a way that's a lot more mobile friendly, do it in a way that's a lot more conducive to not fighting the problems that modern browsers have because of bad actors. So if you don't see your LMS today supporting CMI5, the test suite that's coming out, it's called Project Catapult right now. It's going to be released in the fall if everything goes well. So by the end of the year, it should be in everyone's hands. You'll be able to put your content that's published as CMI5 and test to make sure your content works. And you'll be able to point the LMS vendors at it and say, if you can pass this test suite, your LMS can support CMI5. This is a place where you need to pressure from both ends, the content to authoring tools and the LMS developers. And if we get them both feeling pressure, then the whole standard comes up and the industry works better on the whole. It's up to you all, the instructional designers, to push this forward. At least I'd like to make you think that you're enabled at this point. And if we hear enough of you saying it over and over again, maybe we'll get some real traction on that front. All right, let's see if we have a, wow, this is a big question. Do we have a summary of all the settings options we have and what they mean, more than what is in the little question mark next to each one? Joe, what do our docs look like?
I don't think it gets much deeper, and that's unfortunate. I'll have to look. There is a Ryan wrote. Tell you what, I'm going to try to kill time and try to find this, but I believe there's a user guide for SCORM Cloud, but I don't believe that it goes too deep into the settings itself. I'm going to pull it up here and drag it over, see if I can drag it over. You all saw how well that went with the dress rehearsal earlier. But no, it actually, it does not go too far into that. So really, your best bet is the tooltips, or your second best bet is to, if you have specific questions, reach out. And we're happy to go through stuff.
Well, it looks like we have hit our hour. Joe, thanks. It's been an absolute pleasure getting to do this with you.
Yeah, likewise.
We are absolutely, and we are going to probably post a couple little follow-up links in here. I don't know how long it takes before these presentations become available on the website, but it will become available on the website at some point in the not too distant future. And we'd love to hear your feedback. Please come ask us anything and tell us anything about how you felt and what you want to know more about. If we hear enough, maybe there'll be a SCORM debugging 301 in some eventual future. So thanks so much, everybody.